until then, I'll probably just quickly introduce what this particular session is about, what you can expect. And, I'd like to, first of all, tell you that I don't like giving gyan. I like to, get people interacting, engaging with the conversation that we have. And what I would like to do is to have a conversation with all of you today, to let you guys know what I've done and my perspectives on various things. And I look forward to, hearing from folks that have a little bit of experience in this as well, or if you have any questions in terms of what you can do with this particular technology tool, and anything that you folks have any thoughts around, I would love to get your perspectives on. So this would really come down to you folks as well to make it as engaging and as full of value as possible, right? So today's talk is going to be about the use of generative AI in the field of QA. So I think over the last 1 year, generative AI has had its 15, 30 minutes of fame, whatever you'd like to frame it, right? I don't think there are too many people in the technology field who probably have not heard of it, or at least taken a small peek at what is possible with it. Some have been very successful at using it. Some have been perhaps dismayed at the fact that it does not live up to the hype according to them, because probably when they've tried to use it, or the tools that they've tried to use does not really meet their requirements or the way that they're supposed to be using it. So, that's why I started this poll out. So I'd love to, understand what you folks have experience with this particular technology or with this particular paradigm in terms of, using generative AI, because everybody has a different skill set in terms of what is possible and what is not. Cool. So I think we have a decent number of responses right now. We have about 12 responses. I'd love to get a few more if possible, but I think most people seem to be.
I tried doing that, but it says the type form survey is closed. I don't know, maybe others are facing the same issue.
Are you folks having the same issue?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So let me just go with the basics of what I've got so far. So it seems that most people are at a beginner level. Of generative AI, and you've heard of it, used it somewhat, but not really at a very high level. Is that a common thing that I feel there are people here? There are other people that are quite conversant with it or quite expert with it. Can I just have a show of hands if there's anyone here who feels they're very comfortable with this and they want to know some advanced techniques rather than the more basic techniques over here? So you can use the reactions buttons on your Zoom window. So if you could just put a thumbs up if you're an advanced person, or any other reaction if you're a.
But people are responding in chat. Maybe if you can see them.
Yes, I can see that. All right. So again, so let's start with the basic aspect of it, but I'll try to make it useful to you guys, because ultimately it's all about the practical use of generative AI in this particular field. But I think the consensus seems to be that all of you folks have heard about what generative AI is. Is there anyone who'd like to venture a guess into what generative AI is and how it is different from the AI that we've been using over the last 50 years or so?
Yes, Bharath.
Yeah. So Avinash, you had a statement to make?
Bharat, you can continue. I think that would be okay.
Okay. Cool. So, see, generative AI ultimately is a new paradigm in terms of artificial intelligence, right? So, before we get to generative AI, let's define what intelligence and maybe what artificial intelligence is. So, if you were to say someone is a very intelligent person, someone is extremely good at what they do, ultimately, it is you're describing the way that someone is able to react, respond to a particular stimulus or a particular situation. And usually, it is based on a person's knowledge or some kind of, intuition that the person has in terms of being able to respond to something, right? Respond to a stimulus or an input. So artificial intelligence aims to replicate, this form of responding to a particular situation or a reaction using a computer system, right? And the way that this is done in particular is to look at, a particular input. This could be a picture, it could be words, it could be audio, it could be any form of input that is provided to an artificial intelligence system. And typically, what the computer system does is it tries to break it down into a format which it can recognize in terms of patterns. And once it is able to discern what pattern is available to it, it looks at its training and usually tries to respond based on what its training asks it to do. Right. So that is typically at a very, very basic level what artificial intelligence is all about. So discriminative AI, or the AI that we are more familiar with over the last 50 years, that has been around for a long time now, this basically works in this way. So either there is something called supervised learning, where we tell the AI that, hey, if you see these patterns, respond or react in this particular way. Or there is an unsupervised category of algorithms which says that, okay, if you see data, try to classify it, try to categorize it into different clusters based on the pattern that you see. So it could be based on the size, it could be based on what it is able to detect in terms of an image or text or whatever is provided to it, and classifies it into different formats for itself. The third way is reinforcement learning. Reinforcement learning is a risk-reward way of teaching a machine system to react to a particular stimulus or situation. So you guys would have seen some of those Boston Dynamics robots, right? Which learn how to walk, jump, and open doors, etc. Right? So all of those are working on traditional AI systems, which reward the system if something positive comes out from an outcome, and it gives it a negative if there is some kind of bad situation or situation contrary to the outcome that is required. So in the case of Boston Dynamics robot, being able to move one step to another or being able to complete that is a positive outcome, and anything that allows it to do that is teaching the system that, hey, you should continue doing this because that this is working. And anytime it falls or anytime it collapses, it knows that, hey, whatever I did last may not be suiting the surface or whatever I'm trying to do as of right now. So it understands from that perspective. It is able to detect, hey, if I'm on this kind of surface, I need to do I need to walk a particular way or jump a particular way or jump a particular height, etc. Right? So these were typically the traditional ways of artificial intelligence. So generative AI, is based on the same way of training and learning that a traditional AI system is. In terms of what how it is created, it is not very different. Where it differs from a traditional artificial intelligence system is that it is able to predict or synthesize new output, which may or may not be part of its training. So this is very different from the previous AIs because, as I mentioned right now, the previous AIs would stick to what it knows already or what it can perhaps reach at the boundary of what it knows. Generative AI is free to create or synthesize something brand new from its training, right? It is not bounded by its just its training, right? So in terms of generative AI, the exciting thing about generative AI is that it is able to generate or predict content based on some input knowledge that it has, right? So the way that it typically works is that you give it some kind of input or stimulus. It takes that input or stimulus, it breaks it down, tries to understand what that does, and tries to predict a best response to it, whether it is part of its response or not. And it is trying to create something new. So, the exciting part is that it's able to create something even if it is not part of its training, right? So let's take a look at a little deeper look at how this actually works. So if you guys have used a system like ChatGPT or a Bing Chat or a Google, the chatbot that Google has, for example, you can type into it and it'll give you back a response based on that. So how does this really work under the covers, right? Again, a very, very high level view of this. So when you provide a question to, a large language model, it first of all needs to understand, you need to understand that it doesn't really understand what you're trying to say. The first thing that it does is that it tries to convert whatever you say into numbers which make sense to it. These numbers are called vectors or embeddings. And there are algorithms which are part of the pre-processing part of the large language model or the chatbot that you use. And these convert, whatever text or whatever input you give it, it could be an image or a video or audio as well. And it converts it into, a semantic vector. So a semantic vector is a vector that makes sense to the algorithm or to the, artificial intelligence, aspect of the large language model. And these numbers are not directly mapped to words. They are mapped to phrases. They are mapped to, the context of what you're trying to do. So, hi, how are you? Is a greeting. So the pre-processing algorithms kind of understand that, hey, this is how you need to convert it into a vector. And it would be very similar to any other kind of greeting. So if you say hola in Spanish or you say vanakkam in Tamil, for example, all of these are, according to the large language model, very similar in terms of numbers. When this is fed into the the neural network, which is the basis of most large language models that are used from a generative AI perspective, the neural network kind of takes these and you won't get too much into the depth of that, but basically it flows through the neural network and it tries to predict an output or a response based on the input that it gets. So each of these nodes would get a certain set of inputs, and as it keeps going through the network, it would be able to get a better idea of what is it that has been asked and what is it that it needs to respond with. And ultimately it comes out with a bunch of related predictions, and it would then rank these predictions. So I've given these in clear text over here, but again, this would again be in the form of embeddings or vectors inside the large language model itself. It would then do a ranking of the output that it gets, and then it would say, okay, this is probably the best output or the most confident output that I am with respect to the input that has been provided. So, and this is what it would typically respond with, right? So this is very important for us to understand in the context of what we are planning to do today, because you need to understand that large language models are not sentient. They do not understand by nature what you're trying to do for it. They are basically getting input and they're predicting an output, which is why sometimes the output is very meaningful or very close to what you are asking it to do. And at other times it is rubbish, or it is something completely unrelated to what you have asked or what you are asking it to do, right? So you need to understand that this is how large language models work, especially from a generative AI perspective. So this gives us a lot of challenges and a lot of issues related to how large language models work, right? So given the way that these tools or these algorithms are designed, there are a lot of issues that people typically notice with the results of working with these. Probably the biggest one that people see on a regular basis is the fact that it hallucinates a lot, or it provides things that are completely unrelated to what you're asking or what you have given. It gives things that are completely incorrect sometimes. So you need to know how to work with it to limit it to things that it knows about or that it is able to infer correctly by asking it to cite things, for example, right? There are a lot of issues with respect to the behavior of these algorithms. So if you've gone beyond ChatGPT, for example, you will notice that different models respond to inputs differently, right? So Bing Chat works very differently. A Google Bard works very differently. The Claude, the Anthropic Claude, if you folks have tried that out, works very differently. And when you're trying to use some of the Hugging Face models, which do similar things to the ChatGPT, Bard, etc., you will notice that they give a completely different output to the same kind of prompt that you're asking it to do. Some work better, some work worse, but all of them have a certain set of limitations that are bound, to the way that large language models work. Right? So these are very important for us to understand going forward, because no matter what you do, no matter how you work with these, or no matter how much you trust the output of these large language models, you have to be there to validate what the large language models are giving back to you. You have to work with those and not expect it to solve your problem for you completely. It can get you from 0 to 60% of where you are with respect to the work that you have, but the remaining 30-40% has to come from the user's perspective in terms of working with the output or working with the large language model to fine tune the output that you get back and get it closer to what you wanted to get to. So a lot of people keep asking, hey, generative AI is going to replace a lot of jobs. It's going to take away, it's going to completely devastate industries and stuff like that. And for certain industries which are extremely robotic, or where it can be extremely creative, or it doesn't really matter as to what it does, it has impacted a lot of industries for sure. But in the software development industry, uh, given the fact that there are so many drawbacks to using generative AI, it is something that people need to know that, hey, it is a partner for you as of today. It can really help, improve your quality of work. It can really help you with a lot of things, and it is not going to replace your job. So the people that understand to leverage this particular technology better today will have a much better situation in their careers, a growth, with this particular tool than they would be otherwise. Now, a couple of things that I've not mentioned, in this particular thing are that there are a lot of, organizational or, governance related aspects to using large language models as well. So as a personal user, you can do anything that you want with these and be able to fine tune these and use them however you wish to. However, if you're working in an organization, please be aware that every organization has policies, has ways of working with these large language models. If they are not in place already, they're coming soon. So you need to be aware that there are limitations to what you should be doing with this. If you're working in a service-based industry or a product-based industry, be aware that it is not always safe for you to expose your client's data or your product's data or your company's data to large language models that are not hosted locally. So a ChatGPT, a Bard, etc., they're hosted on some other server, and you don't really know who's going to be taking a look at this data or what they're going to be doing with it. So data privacy, data security, and various other concerns related to use of the data that you're providing all of these tools is paramount. So you need to get a sign off, from your clients, from the people that you're working with, or let people know that, hey, you're working with these tools to do XYZ, so that they are able to take a decision as to whether to use what you're talking about, or hold back and keep it as on the side and not really expose it to production or releases and things like that, right? So I'll take a few questions here if there are any before I move on. I just want to make sure that you folks have understood three things. One, what generative AI is and how it is different from the AI that we've got so far. Two, a brief idea that generative AIs are predictive in terms of the output that they give you, and they are not some kind of supercomputer that is able to answer each and everything. They basically predict an answer based on their training, which may or may not be appropriate given the input that you've given it. And three, that there are limitations or there are issues to using, large language models. So any questions here so far? Okay, looks like everyone is good. So let's move on to, what is generative AI useful for, right? So we've talked about when not to use it or what to be careful about when you're using it. But since you're being positive here and this particular session is about the practical applications of generative AI, let's really dive into, what are they really good for, right? So as of today, I have been able to categorize my work with generative AI into four primary buckets, right? So the first is work that I've been able to do in terms of being able to, augment or automate certain tasks that I have. Again, it is not the sole, thing that I use to automate or augment. It helps me automate or augment things, which I then use to get started faster or get working quickly, for example, before I move on to other things, right? And which kind of frees up my time to be able to really add value to the customers that I'm working with or the people that I'm working with. So it helps me focus and really think about the important things about, am I doing things right? Am I looking at the right things? Am I able to add value to, the work that I would have? It frees up some of my bandwidth in terms of, some of the use cases that we look at. So it frees up a lot for me to become a better tester, become a better QA, become a better developer, become better at designing and working with my team, for example, right? So I'm able to automate or augment a lot of things that I probably was spending, a couple of days on, for example. Now I can do it in an hour, maybe 2 hours, for example. The second category is being able to ideate. And this is something generative AI is awesome at, right? So generative AI is wonderful or a great place for you to get started with when you are trying something new or you are trying to learn something or when you're trying to understand what are some approaches that I could use to solve a particular problem that you have. Again, caveat is be careful about the information that you expose to these large language models. But once you do know that you have the freedom to be able to use certain things, or you're able to anonymize the information sufficiently where it is not able to, where nobody would be able to say, okay, this belongs to this particular customer or company or something like that. You can ask it to help you ideate on certain things. You need a test strategy. It's amazing at coming up with a test strategy. You need to learn about a new technology. It's amazing at teaching you and creating lesson plans and learning paths for you, in terms of learning something new, for example. So I learned, I knew nothing about Playwright, when I started using this. I was able to create an amazing learning plan to learn this particular automation tool. And it not only helped me create boilerplate code, it helped me do a lot of things. It created a learning path saying, hey, start here, learn this, do this, then move on to something else, right? So you can make it help you learn things really well. You need a communications plan or a reporting plan or a report template, for example. It's awesome at creating all of these things which you can use at your work. Right. So ideation is a huge, advantage of using generative AIs. So, that's one of the amazing aspects of using it. Another really, really strong aspect of using generative AI is to be able to customize or personalize things to your preference, right? So it is great, for example, at doing things like code translations. So you are a Java developer, you see some, code, for example, uh, and you want to translate it into Python because that's what you're working with, and you're not use Python, for example. You could ask it to explain that Python code for you that you've got. And you can even maybe ask it to convert it into an equivalent Java code, for example, right? Or you could ask it to output the values, and we'll take a look at the actual examples going forward. But you can ask it to give you a couple of examples of how to use these things for customizing or personalizing it to your preferences. Another awesome aspect of it is to be able to analyze. Now, another aspect or limitation of large language models shows up over here. There are some techniques that people are using to overcome these, but a huge limiting factor for large language models as of today is the fact that there is a limited input size that you can provide the large language models in terms of what you're asking it to do, what information you can give it for it to contextualize the answer better, and for it to respond back with the same context, right? So while people have ideas like I can just feed it in some logs and it'll give me back some responses, uh, today it is not possible, or they're not the best use of that is not the best use of a generative AI, because you really cannot fit everything that you want to within the limited length or context size that you can large language model. However, if you have an issue, for example, you can ask it. So common thing that I do is when I'm writing code and I try to execute something, I get some errors back. I provide this to the large language model and ask it to explain why I'm getting that particular error, and it does a great job of being able to explain why I'm getting this particular error, for example. So it has a lot of amazing uses, but like I said, aware of the limitations that are associated with using large language models as well. So I see a couple of questions over here. Let me, just address those. So Sheetal wrote, can you elaborate on large language models? So large language models, I talked about a little bit, just a little bit earlier. So large language models are basically artificial, intelligence algorithms that use neural networks to be able to respond inputs that are provided to it, right? So this network of nodes that you see in the middle is typically the engine of a large language model. And these nodes are built on huge, masses of training data that is provided to the large language model. And this is an enormous undertaking, and it is such a huge undertaking that not everybody will be capable of creating large language models which are useful, because it takes a huge storage and various other expensive things that people need to do. So these large language models are able to take in an input and predict an output based on the input that they get, right? So Sheetal, if there is any other question on that, happy to answer that. But usually the pre-processing and the post-processing part of the handling the input and providing an output is also part of the large language model, which is outside the bounds of the neural network itself. And the algorithms that are associated with converting an input into embeddings or vectors, or converting vectors back into clear text or plain text, and creating a coherent response is also an extremely large language model. And this usually sets apart the different large language models that you see. Typically, large language models have various characteristics associated with them. One is, the size of the training data that they have been trained on. Second is, the various other things, but the second is, where they are hosted. Is it a locally run one like Llama 2 you can download on your computer and use it, or you using like a ChatGPT, for example, which is hosted in a remote location? It has characteristics like, how much input can you provide and how much output can it give you, for example. So as of today, the free model of ChatGPT, for example, allows you to give about 16,000, tokens of input and output combined for you to work with. They're planning to increase that going forward, but as of today, that is the most reliable, metric that is associated with that. So Pranali asks, I think the Nuance platform is a large language model. So I'm not familiar with Nuance, Pranali. I'm not sure what it is, whether it is a large language model or not. But some of the other, popular large language models from a text-based approach is, ChatGPT, of course, Bard is there. Then you have Llama 2 from Meta. You have Claude from Anthropic, for example. And then you have a bunch of Hugging Face models like Mistral, Zephyr, etc., which are all models that can be hosted on other machines. So even on an AWS, for example, you can host one of these models and create your own, service, for example, right? OpenAI leverages, OpenAI powers Microsoft's Azure OpenAI service, for example. And there are various cloud providers that are coming up with their own versions of, large language models. And Pranay, I hope I've answered your question over here. Divya asks, the example that you gave of the greeting, hi, how are you? How does Gen AI select the accurate phrase? So it doesn't know whether what it is selecting is accurate or not. It does a best guess based on the predictions that it comes up with. So if you were to be asked, like when you are looking at a movie, for example, based on, your, after like, let's say reading into the movie for about 30 minutes, you will be able to guess what happens in the next 10 minutes, for example, right? And that's based on your previous knowledge. You don't know if what your guess is going to be right or not. But, let's say if you're watching a fight scene and you know that this particular, like Game of Thrones, for example, in the beginning, you didn't know whether your favorite character was going to live or die. However, based on what you know, given a particular situation, you would have a best guess as to whether the character lives or dies. So that is kind of very similar to how a large language model works. It first of all predicts what it thinks should be an output based on its input, and it will give you that output based on what it considers to be the highest ranked output, or what its predictions, list of predictions are that it comes out with. It basically just gives you that. Sometimes it works well, sometimes it does not. The more information, the more context you give it, the more you fine tune the large language model with your existing information, the better the output or prediction usually is. Sorry, I interrupted someone saying something. Was there a comment? Sorry. Okay, I'll move on then. Please do feel free to interrupt if you have any questions about any of these things, right? I think it's important that you folks understand this, because this is kind of like the the building block of what we are planning to discuss next in terms of where we stand with respect to generative AI for QAs. So we finally got here, but ultimately, see, generative AI for QAs was something that I took a stab at a few months back in terms of exploring what is possible with this particular technology for a QA, right? And the way that I thought I should go about it was to look at what are some of the problems that I face as a QA, for example, right? Or what do QAs face that I have commonly seen across projects. So, if you notice, a lot of these are things that probably resonate with you, right? You work with very complex systems. There are a lot of different tech stacks that you work with. The requirements that you typically work with tend to be very ambiguous, very difficult for you for you to work with, for example. You're very stretched in terms of the bandwidth that you have, and your ability to be able to do automation and a lot of other cool things. Even if you do have the knowledge and the know-how to do so, you may not really have the time or the resources to be able to do all the things that you want to, right? Things like regression testing, for example, is a huge time suck in terms of you being able to do various things, right? And there are a lot of limitations that people have as testers, such as the lack of realistic test data. Working with test data that can really help you in your different aspects of testing, right? Whether it is component-based testing, whether it is performance testing, or various other things that you're trying to do. But however, I feel that one of the most important things that the testers generally have to deal with is that usually QAs or testers tend to be the bridge of communication between the business folks and the technical folks. And QAs are typically conversant with both sides of the coin, right? So it is very important for QAs to understand that a large part of the work that they do is very communication oriented, and knowing how to be able to create ways of capturing data that make sense to the other side, or being able to communicate things that are happening that are easy for tech folks or business folks to understand is extremely important. And I found that using generative AI is awesome to be able to handle all of these things. So here are some use cases. So I'll focus on a couple of these going forward in the demo that we're going to look at in terms of being able to use generative AI for various things. So I've actually been able to create some applications or use cases or to generate platforms that use generative AI in the backend to be able to do a lot of these things. And I'm happy to answer as many questions that you have on these, or whatever that you would like to know in terms of what is possible and what is not possible with this, right? So using the 4 buckets or categories that we talked about, here are some concrete use cases that you can actually work with. So from an automating or augmenting perspective, it helps a lot. Generative AI is amazing at creating realistic test data for your tests, for example, or for situations, or even if you're dealing with user stories, for example, right? You can really help BAs or your product managers, or the folks that are the business folks, to be able to come up with very realistic test data for the situations or scenarios that they're trying to create. You can customize the data by country, by region, by various other things to make it as realistic as possible, so that you don't need to touch production data, because I think we all know how big an issue handling production data or being able to work with all of that is, right? Another great use of this technology is to create boilerplate code. And again, I say boilerplate code, not complete code, because I still feel that a lot of work needs to be done in terms of actually creating code. It can create code for you, generative AI, but I found that I usually spend a lot more time debugging and trying to figure out what the issue with the code that was given to me is, than coming up with it from scratch from the first perspective. However, if I'm able to create a structure and able to create a boilerplate code for myself, I'm then able to really accelerate my development. And these taken a long time to do to set up properly, for example. You can generate code snippets, you can generate various blocks of code that can be used in your day-to-day work. For example, it's great at doing things like code reviews, code refactoring, for example. All of these are possible with the various tools that are available today. You can use to create strategies like we talked about earlier. You can ask it to create test cases, unit test cases. You can ask it to create test scenarios. You can ask it to review test plans, find out missing aspects of your test plans, for example. You can ask it how to approach, let's say contract testing is something that you have not worked with much. That is something that something like a generative AI can coach you through. It can actually help you coach you and understand how to get started with something like this, right? And we'll take a look at an example going forward. You can look at your existing code and analyze it for smells. You can look at test results. You can ask it to create insights from that. You can do some defect predictions based on your code. Ask it to find out some security issues or bugs or performance related problems in your code from a static perspective. You can provide it limited amounts of log code, for example, like errors, and ask it to do a root cause analysis on these, and perhaps provide you some insight into why something might be happening. What are some things you could take a look at, for example. But input size that you can give it as of today. There's something called streaming LLMs that's just come out recently, which allows you to send unlimited input and get you back unlimited output. It's at a very research stage as of right now, but I think once that comes into being into the mainstream large language models, I think that would completely take away these kind of issues. But as of today, we don't have a proper answer for that as of right now. From a personalized perspective, there are plenty of use cases. What I found great value for is a learning plan. You could use it to translate code for you between different languages. You can ask it to fine-tune code, using solid principles. You could ask it to, look at code and ask it to refactor it using your preference of names, for example. So it can do various things, right? And we can think of many different use cases of being able to use that. Yes, Prachi.
Hi, yes. Just now you were showing up that where all we can categorize like test data creation, automation. Could you please elaborate with some example? For example, test data creation. Suppose I have some system of, and then how step by step, what practical steps? I mean, so that it will we could be relatable more. I mean, something like that.
Sure, it's coming right up.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Any other thoughts? Anything else that people have tried doing, maybe hasn't worked out well for them, or that people feel, hey, this has really worked well for me? Any thoughts from folks that are already here that have been able to work with these technologies so far?
Yes, Bharath. I tried it for one of the code challenge where we usually do. It was an existing framework and browser initialization, driver initialization was correct over there. But somehow, certainly, like if you do not think about application, and I have been involved into that activity where the application was already developed and the automation framework was already developed by the people over there who are mid-junior folks, I would say. So with their understanding, they have developed. The challenge was all the tests were running very slow, damn slow. And we were killing our time to removing the hard-coded weights, adding explicit, implicit, fluent weight, everything. Nothing was working out. Given a try to ChatGPT, I told ChatGPT, tell me the application which I developed using this technology, how we should automate them. It gave me that these kind of applications are using behind the scene, they are using the Ajax calls, JavaScript. So more or less, I need to initialize my driver with the Ajax driver. And if I'm using page object model, I should leverage Ajax page driver thing basically. So that 2 lines of code improved my 20-minute script for 4 test scenarios, reduce its execution time to 7 minutes only.
Awesome. So I think that's a great example of
Yes.
being able to use it for analyzing purposes, right? So as I said, in terms of code refactoring or being able to find smells from a performance or a security perspective in your existing code, it does a great job of handling those things. Anyone else?
Yeah, I gave it a try to create the test scenarios for one journey. So it did gave lot many possible scenarios in that case. So found it little simple to write all the test steps for that.
Awesome. So was it good in terms of the response that it gave you, or did you feel that the responses were a little bit generic and didn't really help your case out?
Yeah, it was little generic, just like basic scenarios it gave, but yeah.
Okay.
So like all the basic scenarios it did give in the results, but we need to work on top of that, like for all the possible coverage.
So did you engage more with the large language model to give you back more results, or did you just take the response that it gave you and worked on it?
Yeah, I just went with the response which it gave back.
Okay. Great. We'll take one more person. Yeah, Saurabh.
Yeah, so basically, can you hear me? Am I
Yes.
audible? Yeah.
Yes.
So I think one of the thing which has been useful, particularly my experience, has been how you write the prompt. And I think the entire prompt engineering itself is a good course to discuss. So it helped me because I refined my prompt, certain things like setting the context, what is that I want, how do I want, what kind of tone I need, etc., etc. So I'm still learning, but I saw it helps, and particularly if you write a good prompt, I think the response which comes is much better compared to what we see if we just write it randomly. It hallucinates in many cases, the word. But I have a personal challenge. See this Chat GPT, and I use Python code. And the problem, what happens is the token gets used very fast, and then it stops responding, saying that this is there. Now there is a Chat GPT 4, which is more of a paid version. So I just wanted to check with you your view. Is Chat GPT 4 worth investment, or should we move to Google Bard and all? I mean, I've started using Google Bard now because I was repeatedly facing the same problem of token getting exhausted, though I use multiple emails and phones, etc. So I switched to Bard. So I just wanted to you understand your personal opinion. Is GPT-4 that I should migrate, or I should look for different options?
So so see, no matter what commercial service you use, they will always charge you by tokens, and you will run out of token limits very quickly. So try looking at Ollama, OLLAMA, and use it to host local, what do you call it? Try hosting local large language models on your
Okay.
machine, because that you can use locally, and that'll never run out
Use
of.
the token thing, huh?
Yeah, so there is still a limitation in terms of the context size that you can provide, but you can do it multiple times or as many times as you want. So you can keep breaking a problem down and using a locally hosted large language model. So try playing with that if you because
Ollama, OLLAMA, you said.
yes, right, and
Okay.
you can get any number of large language models from a Hugging Face perspective. There are tons of great large language models out there today, which you need to practice a little bit, unfortunately, but you will be able to overcome that, because I'm assuming, just for the just for the purpose of the audience here, I believe, is it Sabi or Saurabh?
You can call me Saurabh, yeah.
Okay. So based on what Saurabh is saying, he's accessing the generative AI through the APIs and not necessarily through the chatbot. So he runs out of tokens or being able to use that because they charge you for the amount of input and output that they provide you, and that's how the business model works. So if you are trying to use that through the APIs, try making a switch to the local large language models.
Thanks.
Awesome. Cool. So in the interest of time, I'll move on. I'd be happy to take any questions coming forward. So let's take a look at some practical uses of these, right? And as Saurabh mentioned, a very important aspect of interacting or working with large language models is to be able to specify what is it that you're trying to ask it to do, right? And a big part of this entire work is being able to instruct it properly in terms of how it should work, right? So the first thing that we're going to take a look at is prompt design. So this is not prompt engineering as yet. This is prompt design. So being able to structure your input in a way that makes most sense to the large language model, right? So I think most of you guys would have worked with a very simple example of what is a large language model. And if you have interacted with ChatGPT type of tools before, you would have probably just asked it to do something, right? So here is an example. So just give it an instruction and say, create a presentation for me in GPT. So it gives you back some answers, but you'll notice that the answers tend to be very generic, very limited in context, and perhaps not really what you are looking for. It helps you get started, but it's not a great use of this particular technology, right? Just asking it to do something. Sometimes when your needs are simple, it's great. But if you're trying to get something more nuanced, it is very important for you to be able to these attributes to the prompt, right? So a good prompt would have an action, as you saw just now. It would need to have a persona, right? Unless your large language model, which we'll be talking about a little bit later with Ada, is contextualized to do something in a particular way, it is very important for you to add a persona to the instruction that you're providing it, right? So an example of this would be to tell the large language model to play a particular role. So the reason why a persona or all these instructions are extremely important is it helps the neural network that the instructions or the tokens flow through remove things that are not relevant to the predictions that it is trying to make. The more open-ended you make the question or the instruction that you give the large language, the more generic the prediction or the response is going to be. By providing a persona to the prompt or as part of the instruction that you're giving the large language model, you're able to make the data better and come up with a more a better perspective. So the first example of just creating a simple thing, it just came up with a bunch of text on how GPT works, for example, right? However, when you ask it to be come up with output in as a speaker, you want it to create an engaging a presentation, for example, and you're telling it to provide you ideas for content, etc. You'll notice that it is doing a much better job of structuring the output in a way which makes it perhaps easier for you to then convert it into a presentation, for example, right? So adding a persona is helping you limit the neural network or limit the predictions to something that is more highly relevant to you. The third is to specify what kind of output you would like to see back from the large language model. And again, the more specific you are with the output, the better the response is from the large language model, right? So in this, I have added a persona, I've given it an action, and I have given it an output format. So let's say I want to create a programmatic presentation, for example, right? So I wanted to provide me back the response in terms of a JSON document, which I can quickly parse and create my own presentation using some of the libraries that are out there today, for example. So once I give this, you'll notice that not only is it giving me the content in the way that I want, it is also giving me the output in a way that makes it much easier for me to parse through this entire response and be able to do something programmatic with it. So it is not for me to be able to just look at something and do something. I can now automate the way that I respond to the way that the back with a response as well. The next is to provide some output in terms of or to provide more in terms of information that is provided to the large language model, right? So the more context or information you are able to provide it, and in this example that we're going to take a look at, in this example that we're going to take a look at, Here, I am not only giving it the persona, I'm not only giving it the output that I want, I'm also attaching certain rules associated with what I wanted to create. So for example, I want the first slide always to be an agenda. I only want 4 slides back in terms of the content that I wanted to create. So by being able to limit all of these things, or being able to provide all of these limitations to the response that the large language model has in responding back to me, I'm able to, again, work with it in a way where I'm able to automate the work that or the response that I'm able to get back with it. And another important aspect of this is that this also helps me, uh, you know, limit or make it more repeatable. Sorry, was there a question there?
No, I think there is some echo, Bharat, not from your side.
Okay, cool. So the point is that, it is important for us to understand these rules because it also helps reduce the hallucinations of, GPT, and also makes sure that the work that you're getting back is more usable in terms of what you can expect back from it. So after, all of these things, here is a more complete prompt. Now you can make this more and more refined. You can provide feedback to it and say, hey, I like this aspect of it. Or, hey, you missed out this aspect of it. Maybe if you do these, you should be able to give me back more ideas. But if you notice, this is a more complete instruction or a prompt that you can provide a large language model. And the more you do this, the better it is able to give you back. So any questions here? Have you folks tried this before?
Sir, this is Sonal Kulkarni. I have tried it before in my data mining, text mining project of MTech.
Awesome. So what are some of your learnings?
The great experience working with AI along with data mining and text mining knowledge. And along with that, had great experience dealing with unsupervised, supervised data, then using routers data set, etc.
Awesome. So what worked well for you? What did not work well for you?
Actually, everything was learning that time. So I was learning, I was making some mistake. From those mistakes, I was learning. And again, yes, the project was successful.
Awesome. Great.
Yeah.
Lovely. Anybody else? Cool. So Ganesh, you have a question. So what other tools would you recommend to explore? So as of today, the generative AI market is going crazy, right? There are new products coming out almost every week, which are really worth looking at. I'm going to be talking about 2 today, primarily from a non-coding perspective to cater to the most common denominator here, so that everybody can leverage the what they learn as of today in their day-to-day. But if you're comfortable coding, please take a look at Olama. Olama is an awesome port. So that I'll type the name of that in the chat. So Olama is being able to host local large language models and exposing those APIs to you, easily. Take a look at all the other competing chatbots as well. So there's Bard from Google, there's Claude from Anthropic, there is Llama, which again is a locally hosted large language model from Meta. There are tons of other smaller ones that you can find on Hugging Face. So Hugging Face is a central site for anything AI or machine learning. It's an amazing site. Please go register there. Take a look at some of the work that is happening, or the community boards where people discuss all these kind of work that they're doing, for example. You'll get a lot of ideas, you'll get a lot of information about things that are happening in the industry today, in terms of various things that you can do with not just generative AI, but anything from an AI ML perspective, right? So coming back to the prompt itself, right? So we talked about 5 things that a prompt should have. So the first is giving it a persona or asking it to play the role or entity. The second being able to give it an action, a direct action for it to work with. Am I audible? Hello?
Yes, Bharath, you are.
Okay, great. The second being a direct action for it to work with. The third being, being able to provide it enough information or context for it to understand what needs to be done and structuring that context. The fourth being some rules or information, if you do have any rules of information that are associated with the work that you're trying to do. And, fifth being very careful with the output that you wanted to, give you, right? So these are some of the things that you should always think about when you're dealing with large language models. Now, some of the best practices in terms of working with prompts, creating good prompts, not necessarily prompt engineering, but just good rules of thumb that you should follow, is that you should always, separate the instruction from the context, which makes it more readable for you when you are trying to edit the prompt to make it better and better for you, right? So when you do that, I notice I've given that twice, but yeah, so you should, it's very important for you to separate both. You should be very specific and avoid flowery language. So a lot of people, are very polite when they are talking to a large language model, right? Almost like they're talking to a person. So, words are money. The more number of words you use, the more costly it is for the organization or for the large language model to process the input and give you back the output that it can. So given the size of the context window, it's very important for you to be very specific with what you wanted to do and to avoid anything that is unwanted words, unwanted phrases, etc. I would use something like a Quillbot or Grammarly, for example, to try to reduce the size of your prompt, right? So that it is saying the same thing but using fewer words to be able to get back what you need. It is very important for you to what you consider to be bad output for it to give you, the best quality output that you can get. And typically, using the latest model is good. It doesn't always work out this way, but the latest models tend to have more training data or more updated training data, and it is easier for you to work with those, and they tend to have text window as well in terms of the amount of input and output you can get back. So try to keep a lookout for the latest model. However, make sure that if you already have something that is working with an existing model, do not switch unless you have a good reason to do so. Next is, sorry, there is a question from Avinash, how to let optimum code from ChatGPT or any AI. So I'm not sure what the question is. So
the problem is I have around 2200 lines code and want to get it optimized from ChatGPT.
Okay.
But ChatGPT is saying that it's too long. So what is the way to crack code and get the optimum code out of it?
Okay, so there are ways for you to break down the code. So I think if you have one piece of code which is so long, you are probably expecting it to do too much. So using other tools like Aider, which I will be talking about shortly, is something you can take a look at to work with code, for example, right? So that is a good way for you to look at alternative tools that are more focused on code. So Copilot from GitHub, for example, could be a better alternative for you to work with code rather than a ChatGPT. So understanding which large language model best suits your need or best tool suits your need is an extremely important part of the work that you do with large language models as well. So as of right now, most people know GPT, Bard, Bing, Chat, etc. But these are just ways for you to get introduced to the topic. there are programmatic ways of interacting with these large language models. So you may need to explore that. There are tools like Aider, which help you look at code and optimize code, for example. You might want to look at that. You may want to refactor your code, make it smaller, or make it or give snippets of your code rather than give the entire code for you to work with these models. Because like I said, the context size of the window that it can take in is limited as of today. So you need to be aware of these limitations and work around those. Cool. Any questions related to creating or designing a good prompt so far?
I think we can continue, Bharath, for now.
Okay, so I'll share this presentation with you folks going forward. So some of the things that I will be showing right now, you can try out on your own. So I've created a set of exercises for you guys, just to try out, some of the things that I'm showing you right now, just so that you get some confidence in working with these tools, going forward. Just 1 second. Let me just turn on the light. I think it's getting a little dark. Awesome. So let's take a practical example of how would you really do this with an existing tool, right? So what I'm going to be doing here is something that I think all testers work with, right? So you usually you start with a user story. You would need to look at that user story, look at it for completeness, definitions of done. You would need to create test scenarios from it. And once you create the test scenarios, you'll need to automate some of them. You'll need to test some of them. You need to create test data for these. So let's take a look at a very quick example using these prompt design principles that we talked about earlier of how to work with these, right? So the outcome that we are looking for are some test cases, some which we can use as a basis for a test plan or working with the developers to say, okay, these are some unit test cases, these are integration or higher level test cases that we'll be handling. Here is some automation that we might need to build with, and these are perhaps some sanity test cases, etc. So we can use both tools or any number of tools for these. I'm using one of these two, but there are many other tools that you can use. So ChatGPT is the chatbot. I'm using that as the version rather than the code version for two primary reasons. So the first is that there is a certain amount of context or history that is recalled by the large language models when you work with it in a chatbot mode. And this history does not need to be constantly be given to the large language model when you are giving a new prompt to it, when you're working in the chatbot mode, right? So it remembers the conversations that you had, both the input and the response that it gave you. So for more intermediate or beginner users, it is better for you folks to work with the chatbots rather than the code because of all of these things, right? One, you can overcome the output limitation by asking it to continue generating, for example. So you can get a much bigger output for the same input that you give through a chatbot rather than through your code. The second is that the input that you provided is easier for you to edit and to read. And you can do a lot with the free versions of all of these softwares, right? Bard, ChatGPT, Anthropic's Claude 2, for example, rather than using the API version, which is very costly for people to use, right? And the third is that it makes it better for folks to understand prompt design and principles when you work with it in a chatbot mode, when you're able to give it feedback, when you're able to provide input to it for it to get iteratively better at the output that it performs. So the outcome that I would expect from here is to take a feature story like this. So this is for a particular feature. It has two scenarios that are provided to me by let's say a product manager or a business analyst, and they want me to be able to, do testing with this, right? So there are various things that you would want to do with this. So first is to be able to, first understand what is it that you wanted to do, right? And let's take the prompt design principles that we talked about. The first thing that you would want to do is to give a persona to the large language model that you're working with. This is very important, especially in non or more generic, large language models like a ChatGPT, but because this is designed for any number of situations. So to limit it and make it more contextual to what you're trying it to do, you need to make it persona specific. Once you do that, and you give it some context in terms of, hey, this particular story is related to an e-commerce application. In my example, I have a generic feature story, but in your examples, you would need to provide a lot more information or context related to, the business, what it is doing, what is happening, etc. Once you do that, you can then provide it an action or instruction. Be very specific with your action. Make sure that you do not provide contradicting actions on top and at the bottom, right? You need to be very clear about what the instructions to the large language model are. Once you do that, you need to separate out the instructions and certain constants or things that you do not want it to process from a semantic point of view. So here I'm asking it to provide output in a table format with specific column names. I do not want it to provide column names with a different I want it to be as repetitive as possible, the output that it provides. So I am delimiting things that I want it to be as is within some kind of stopper symbol. You can use anything. You can use @ signs, you can use any characters to delimit where your start of sequences and end of sequences. And anytime any of these large language models see these kind of sequences, they know that whatever is contained within those sequences should not be parsed semantically. It should be taken as is. So here, for example, the column names I have put within a stop and a start sequence using 3 hashes. And I have asked it to say, please give it to me in this way. So when I do this, it is then able to, this is the instruction that I give. And usually the way that large language models today work is that there are 2 aspects to the way that it works. So first is a system prompt that you can ask it to apply to every single prompt that you provided, right? So this first part that I'm giving is a common instruction for it to be able to process any user story. So I've given it 1 user story here, but I can give it any number of user stories, and it knows that for that particular prompt, it should always perform these set of steps. So this is called a system prompt. And then you have your user prompt, which is what keeps changing on a regular basis. So even when you're doing a programmatic API call to anything like a GPT or any other large language model, you will always provide it a system prompt, which is something that is always going to be repetitive on all the prompts that you send. And then there will be a dynamic part, which is going to be the part which is going to be constantly changing, right? Which is called a user prompt. And what I've given here is the user story that I wanted to process, and it gives me back a set of stories in the format that I want. So I wanted it to give me a test ID, and you can ask it to process the test ID in any particular format that you wanted. I've asked it to categorize the test that I asked it to give. Asked it to give it some test steps, and the more information you give about how the application works, how it is set up, what the tech looks like, how the architecture can be described, for example, it does a much better job of contextualizing the output based on that. So if, for example, I had given things like, hey, the front end is done using Flutter, or it is done using PHP, or whatever, right? It will be able to provide you better tests for the technology that you're using as well. So it gives me, a set of test steps. It's not very descriptive, so that might be something I wanted to elaborate on. It's giving me a test outcome. Again, it's giving me a single sentence, maybe something I wanted to elaborate on. And I've asked it to list out what are the assumptions it is making in creating this particular test, for example. So what are some dependencies? What are some things that I wanted to take a look at? So this really helps me get started in terms of the work that I want. However, there are certain things that I want to work more with it, right? So I don't feel that the tests are complete. I feel that, hey, there are some missing tests. Now, in this particular example, I'm just saying, hey, your tests do not seem to be complete. Are there any missing scenarios? So I'm giving feedback to this to make it iteratively better, right? And because I'm using this in a chat window, it is remembering the inputs and outputs that it gave previously, and it is able to provide output based on what was already asked. If I was to do this programmatically, I would need to store this response somewhere and crunch it and provide that also with the input that I am asking. So for people who are not very interested in getting to that aspect of it, this is a great way for you to work with this, right? So once I do that, it then says, okay, yeah, there are some things missing, completed. You can keep doing this till it says, no, there is nothing else I see in terms of, adding to this. So if you've heard of things like autonomous agents and all of that, this is how it works. They constantly keep pinging back the large language model asking, is it complete? Is it complete? Is it complete? Till it gets back a response saying, okay, nothing more can be done. Once it does that, then you can move on to the next phase. Here I've stopped with one, but you can keep iteratively trying to get it to improve, either by giving it feedback saying, elaborate on certain things, or do something extra, for example. Okay. Next, I've asked it to say, can you give me some sample data for these as well? So it is able to do that. Now, it does not always do a great job firsthand. So it is always good for you to give an example. Here I've not used an example, but if you can give an example of test data that it can give you for a particular test, if you want it in JSON, if you want it in a CSV format, you can provide all of that here, so that it is easier for you to take this and work with it going forward, right? So these are all tips and tricks for you to use to make your interaction with the large language models better, right? Then once you create this, I wanted to convert this into automation code, for example, right? So here I've given a couple of sentences in terms of the tool that I wanted to use. But before that, I'll show you with the other tool that you can also ask it to look at the situation that you have, the technology that you have, and recommend which automation tool is best given your existing knowledge, your team's preferences, and things like that. And you can even create an automation comparison table, etc. So we'll get to that now. But let's say I want to use Selenium WebDriver. I'm saying, hey, can you use Selenium WebDriver? I can give it a version as well, and ask it to create some boilerplate code for me to get started, right? So usually the best practice here would be to ask it to structure the folder first, rather than just creating the code itself. Because when you have a code structure, you're creating a proper harness, which can then be used for your testing, and it makes it extensible, it makes it reusable, etc. In this particular example, I've just asked it to create some boilerplate code, and it is able to create some boilerplate code. I've run this, and it works fine, right? So I will share all of these with you, so you can take a look at these when you click on these links. All this information that I've shown you is going to be there when I share this with you folks, right? So it creates this code, but I'm not very happy with the way that the code has been created. It looks very scripty. It doesn't look like a proper modular code, right? So I've asked it to refactor the code to make it more more maintainable and to have better naming structure, for example. So in this example, I've used Python, but you can ask it to code in any of the common languages that you use. It could be JavaScript, it could be Java, it could be Scala, anything that you feel more comfortable with, right? So that is the personalized, customized aspect of large language models. So when you do this, if you'll notice that it is now doing a better job of creating different functions and limiting the scope of these functions to particular actions. And it is adding better documentation and things like that. And it gives you a small way of creating this, right? So these are ways of working with this and making it better and better. You may have some existing code that you may wanted to integrate with this as well. So you can do that also. But again, be careful of what you share and what you do not. If your customers or the people that you're working with do not feel comfortable using large language models, please do not use it. Find other ways to work around it, or make your code anonymous, or in a way such that nobody can make out that it is your production code or your code that is being used, for example, right? In order for you to do that. So all of these things I have done now. And the last part, which I would usually start with, I've asked it to create a code structure for me to be able to figure out, how do these things really fit in, and what is a best practice for me to create a good harness so that this entire project repository becomes easy for me to use and share with others, so that other people can contribute and make it extendable as well, right? So this is a great way for you to get started with, and you can get a lot of information of how all of these things should be there. So ChatGPT does a great job of this, but there is a lot of human interaction that needs to go in with this. You need to pair with this to make sure that all of this is workable code, usable code, and do not just take it as is, right? Because you will run into a lot of issues if you just take it, copy paste it, and try running it. You need to understand what's happening as well, and why it is suggesting what it is suggesting, because it is going to lead you to a lot of grief if you don't know how to debug all of these things, right? Any questions regarding this? Have you guys tried using this before? Any thoughts on what has worked and what is not for you? So a lot of the skill regarding this comes from experience. You have to try using this. You cannot, just use it once or use it twice and expect to be good at it. The more you use it, the better you will get at using these tools. So the second one, something that I like a lot. I apologize for the quality of the video that I've recorded it with. But Ada is a great tool for you to be able to use, especially from a coding perspective. So, we saw first that we have the same story. I've saved it off as a file in a project structure. And, I'm invoking Ada. So Ada is in the document that I've shared in this presentation, you will find a link to get to this tool and how to install it, etc. This needs an OpenAI API key. So you would need to log into the platform OpenAI, create a secret API key. I've given instructions on how to do all of these as well in there. Once you do that and you export it, you should be able to install Ada. So it is a Python tool, so you will need Python. And once you install this, it will work with any programming language, right? It's not limited to Python or anything like that. It can work with Java, Scala, it can create code, it can debug, it can review, it can refactor, etc. Now, the difference between Ada and ChatGPT is Ada is specifically made for coding. So the amount of persona information you need to provide is a lot less than you would need to do with a general, tool like a ChatGPT, for example, right? In terms of your security and compliance, it has the same implications. It is sending data to OpenAI. If you're using this through OpenAI Azure, that is usually boxed into, a local or an organizational or an enterprise perspective. So that should be completely fine. If you are planning to use Ada from a personal perspective, there should be no issue. But if you are using it at an organizational level, be aware that you need to be careful, or you need to be careful with what you expose it to, right? So you may want to work on this with open source code initially, for example, just for you to get comfortable using it. Maybe you can showcase the benefits of using this to the people that would make a decision on using this in your actual software. Because I personally find amazing use from this. So, please do try working on this and try using it out, right? So once you install Ada, you should be able to go to the folder that you are currently working on, or the folder that you wanted to work on. You can track the changes that this makes using what do you call it? In this particular instance, I've chosen not to. So the first thing that you need to do is add whatever files you wanted to take a look at to context. So I believe someone is asking, I have a 2,200 piece of line code file. All you need to do is add that particular thing to the window and remove anything else. And this would be able to work specifically on that piece of code, right? So some of the great features of this particular tool is that it can help explain various things that are happening in the code for you, right? So in this particular thing, I'm not very familiar with this feature file. It is able to read in this feature file, and it is able to tell me exactly what is in there and explain what is in there. In this particular case, there's some Gherkin language which explains what a feature should be. So it summarizes that for me, and then it gives me a small what do you call it, learning in terms of how do I use the given when then format in Gherkin, for example, to create a feature file, right? So once I do that, I might have more questions to ask in terms of these, and I can ask it to keep explaining this as much as I want. Otherwise, in this particular case, if you notice towards the bottom of the screen, I've asked it to create a bunch of test scenarios, thinking about functional testing, security, and accessibility, right? And performance. And I want it to provide me the output back in the form of a table, which it is able to do so. Just very similar to your ChatGPT. But in this case, let's say, I just want to take a look at various test scenarios that I'm taking a look at. I'm asking it to do based on that. Now, another great thing about this particular tool as well that I like is that this also remembers the context of what you are chatting with. If you turn on the tracking that you have when you start working with this, for example, it is able to remember the context of what you had set initially. So it is able to provide you more contextual output. So once you are done iterating and completing the tests, for example, now I'm asking it to create a test harness for me. And before I can create a test harness, I'm asking it to create a comparison of the different automation tools that are available out there today, right? And I can give my preferences. So I can say I want open source tools, I want commercial tools, and various other things. And as you can see, it is creating a matrix of comparing the different tools, and given my preferences of what I know how to code with, or what my team knows how to code with, or any other preferences that I have. So in my prompt, I told it that I prefer Python coding, but I am also comfortable coding in Java or JavaScript. Can you provide me some names? And it gives me various ways to compare these. Now you can give it more, input to say, hey, you've forgotten about comparing these aspects. Can you compare these aspects as well? Or, can you elaborate a little bit more on what browsers it is compatible with and not compatible with? Can you give examples of how it can be used? All of these things you can ask it to do, right? So once I do that, I can ask it to create a complete repository for me, right? So given whatever information I have seen so far, I have asked it to create a test harness using Cypress to be able to do the automation for me. So the first thing that it does is it gives me the code structure and says, are you okay with this? It explains the code structure and says, this is why you need to create it in this particular way. And the more specific you are in the prompt of saying use clean code, use solid practices, use, don't repeat yourself, dry, for example. When you do all of these things, it makes it very specific in terms of how, good the output is. And the more specific you are with this, the better the output becomes. So in this particular example, it goes into great depth of explaining how the example that it gave is very closely related to the prompts and the principles that I asked it to create the code with, right? Which is very useful for me, especially if I'm a beginner and I'm not very familiar with how these things work. Now, the last part is I can actually create the code with this as well. So in this particular example, it does not. But if you were to create the code structure like it does over here, and it gives you instructions on exactly how you need to go about creating the code instructions, for example, you can, once you do that, you should be able to, you should be able to go into that, add the folders to the window, and it will create all the code for you as well, right? So these are great tools for you to play around with, and the more the familiar you get with playing around with these tools, the easier it will be for you to work with these and get better at using these, right? So as you can see, there's the amount of things that you can do with is only limited by your imagination and the amount of work that you put into getting this to work, right? Just to reiterate, whatever we talked about in terms of making it better is, first is always make sure that the instructions that you're giving it are clear, specific, and do not have fluff. Use tools like Quillbot, Grammarly, etc., to make your prompts as specific and as concise as possible. Second thing, very important, is iterate on your responses. Do not just take the first response that comes back. Make sure that whatever responses you're getting back are getting better and better as you work with them. Experiment with the prompts to kind of look at new ways to work with them, communicate better, see what works well for you in your particular situation. And depending on what you're trying to achieve, you will be able to do better with certain types of things. You need to provide context or information for it to get better results back. So using personas, giving rules, giving information in terms of context, in terms of the situation that you wanted to work with, are all extremely important for the output that you get back. When you're working with code, for example, there are parameters called things like tokens, max tokens, or temperature, there's the p-values, etc., which are just how creative or how repetitive the responses tend to be. Maybe for the context of the tools that I've shown you so far, that is not so important, but you can set the temperature and make it more deterministic or less deterministic, depending on how you want the responses to be. Okay? Review and edit the responses. Do not ever take the responses that you get back from large language models, because it can have bias, it can have wrong data, it could have hallucinations built in. So you need to make sure that you need to work with it properly, right? And as I said, if you're comfortable working with a particular model or a particular tool, try experimenting with others, but do not replace something with something newer just because it is more shiny. Make sure that it meets your requirements and is able to do everything that your old tool was able to do, if not better. At least meet the existing standard so that you can keep up with it. So, these are some of the very important things that you need to understand when you're working with large language models from a practical perspective. So I will share this with you. So you will have access to all of these things that I showed you, the prompts, everything is embedded inside. So you can take a look at this and please play around with it. I'd love to get some of your thoughts in terms of what's worked, what's not worked for you folks. And please do connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to connect with folks and discuss things. So please just let me know what you guys think, and I'll be happy to answer any questions offline after this as well. Yeah. So that's it for me. I'm happy to take any questions if you have any.
I don't see, Bharath, any questions for now. Okay, Prachi, you wanted to ask something?
No, not a question actually, but just wanted to give a feedback. Actually, it was a very awesome session. I mean, in very simplified manner, in detailed way, Bharat explained very good. I mean, to the point. So thank you for this.
Absolutely, Prachi and Bharat, we have similar comments in the chat as well. Maybe you can have a look at the chat box. People are really appreciating your session and they liked it very much.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for the opportunity. I really, again, hats off to all you folks for taking time off on the weekend to learn something new and explore something new. I really hope that, you folks really do take some of these tips and tricks. I'd love to know what works, what doesn't work. And like I said, I'm always available on LinkedIn for you to connect with, and happy to take discussions. And I write a lot of stuff on this. So keep a lookout for something new that I show as well.